are studied or analyzed where they happen. And the same happened with agricultural risk. Agricultural risks are also contextual. That means that the analysis that is done in one country or in one region cannot be replicated or doesn't actually reflect the realities of another region in another context. Having said that, what we are proposing today, this publication, this gender and agricultural risk, is not a methodology or guidelines of how to do things that how to do risk assessment in agriculture. Rather, what we are proposing is an approach that, if used, can be actually very useful to be applied in different contexts. So having worked that the outcome of any agricultural risk assessment with agenda integration should actually be in order to inform better targeting and policy decision and investment in order to strengthen the resilience of agricultural systems. So having said that, I would like to here it is. This is the content that I'm going to propose today. And the content here actually reflects is a reflection of the process that the team had while undertaking this work. First of all, we're going to discuss why gender, and then we're going to discuss whether there is a gender differentiated impact, whether there is a gender differentiated response, and if it is true that those differentiations do exist, then how to do it then. And then we're going to have some words on how to go forward. So it is very unfair for the team that I will explain such a complex issue that are in this document in very few minutes, like today. And the risk is that we raise more questions than we answer, but that's what we have today. We're taking this risk, and instead of going through the very details of each one of these chapters or contents in the documents, I will share with you the experience and the process the team went through while doing this work. So let's start. The first part is why agenda lens. So the team had the challenge to prove some initial working hypotheses. And the working hypotheses we have were that, well, women farmers are more vulnerable to agricultural risks than men farmers are. And why we said that? Because the initial research that we had was telling us that women farmers in the same conditions as men farmers, they had less productivity. And less productivity due to basically that they have fewer endowments, they have less access to information, and they are less mobile. So also, we saw at the initial stages that men and women respond to work risk in different ways. And why was that? Because the primary roles that women and men play in their own households and in their communities. And finally, that women farmers typically have different constraints than men do when they are facing exogenous shocks. So with this initial working hypothesis, once we tested them, then we had the justification for doing this piece of work. And the justification is that if we do this and we manage to produce some guidelines in order to integrate the gender dimension in agricultural risk management assessment, then we will have a much more targeted policies and interventions. And in the end, this will also make a great contribution to the World Bank overall objective of resilience to households and resilience to agricultural systems. So we started then, once we justified our work, then we started doing this literature review in order to have a better understanding what exogenous shocks were in rural households. Let me start by saying that the team embraced the assumption that households do not behave as homogeneous units. They are not when confronted with shocks. When confronted with shocks, men and women take different decisions because of their roles and because of their endowments. And in other words, what it doesn't hold what most economists say, that there is a Pareto optimality. That means that there is no efficiency in the use of the resources when confronted with exogenous shocks. If that hypothesis we're saying that the unitary household was not true, that means if household behaves as a unitary unit, then we don't have to do this work because it will be efficient the way men and women respond to shocks. But if there is the differentiation, then that gives us all the justification for carrying on the work. So in the end, once we did all this literature review, we found in general three basic things. One, that economic shocks do not have homogeneous effects on farmers' households, as we were thinking, that gender matters in explaining the different effects, but not just the first round of effect, which is the direct impact, but also the second round of effects, which is the coping mechanism, how they respond to shocks. So there is a very clear differentiation. And overall, these effects are have variation across countries, across regions, across different stages of development. So that means also that, again, proving that risks are contextual. And the analysis that has to be done in one region or in one country has to be tailor-made, has to be custom-made to the specific context or situation in that region. So are these different? What are the basic reasons? What are the causes of why there is a differentiated impact, if there is any? Then we identify that there are basically three variables, among others. There are many other variables that explain this, but for sake of simplicity, we went into depth, and you can see in the document that asset ownership, division of labor, and information and knowledge are the three variables that can explain, let's say, those differences. Asset ownership, because men and women tend to have and dispose and use of different assets. Women tend to have, in rural areas, more liquid assets, like jewelry or small livestock, whereas men tend to have much a different type of assets. So if they have different assets, when there is a exogenous shocks, the impact is going to be different. The same goes for division of labor, because it's women in some areas, for instance, are responsible for fetching water. And if there is a drought, for instance, the impact is going to be on women that is going to get more labor and go to more extent in order to fetch water in faraway places. So, and the same goes for the information and knowledge. Information and knowledge explains how households or individuals can actually have awareness, preparedness, and how they respond to shocks. So if there is a different degree of information and knowledge between men and women, as it has been proved, then also exogenous shocks are going to have a very differentiated impact. Equally, regarding responses, the literature has also showed to us that men and women respond different to agricultural risk. So they don't just are impacted different, but they respond different in different ways. And then what we have found is when there is a exogenous shock in a household, in a rural household, the first thing that household do is sell assets in order to cope with the situation. But the first assets that are sold are women's assets because they own the more liquid assets. So obviously the first asset that will go to the market are the women assets. And if the situation gets worse, then other assets will be sold. So here you can see a differentiation or also of the response. A second thing that households do is to get into debt. They recur to debt. And this is mostly a men's activity. Men are more credit worthiness than women for various reasons that we are not going to go into here. So another differentiation of the response. A third could be migration. Men, in terms when there is a crisis, they migrate to look for work and to sell labor in construction or in near towns. But the same do also women. However, women are less mobile, and the ones who go to look for work and migrate are young women with all the dangers of having very young women working in urban setting. If the situation, for instance, of a drought continues to go deeper, then in the end, households just have the last resort, which is to reduce consumption. And reduce consumption is that they get more into poverty. However, the managing of reducing consumption is mostly made by women because women are mostly responsible for food security. So we see here how there is a differentiated response to agricultural risk. And if we don't take this into account when we are analyzing risk, then we are missing something very important that could inform our policy decisions and interventions and the designs of agricultural risk management strategies. So in the end, these issues of gender differentiation that we found have provided us the context, and they are very key areas on that call development practitioners or have a more targeted interventions. And having more targeted interventions with a gender lens, it means that we are potentially also aiming at higher productivity levels because the same tools that are useful for agricultural risk management also will increase productivity. And we also have these multiple effects of food security, protect livelihoods, poverty reduction, and in the end, we are aiming at the overall objective of strengthening resilience in agricultural systems. Now, with this slide here, we're getting into the second part of the book. The first part was basically all the gender context and justification for doing our work. And the second part is how to do it. And when you see the document, you will obviously notice that we went at great length in explaining how to do it. And there is some degrees of complexity and technicalities in that second part, which we are not going to go into, but we are going to walk you through what is the content of that part. Some comments we have received, early comments, is that probably the value added of this work is mostly in this second part, in this how to do it. So on how to do it, practically what we are doing is answering that question that are here on this slide. The guidelines are suggesting that we should actually do risk assessments for the various agricultural supply chains that are in a country, that are part of the agricultural sector. And the questions are, what are the risks that are impacting men and women? And we divided that into 3 types of risk: production risk, market risk, and contextual risk, or enabling environment risk. And we also want to see if there are any regional differences in that analysis. But we don't stop there, but because we also want to see what is the current risk management practices by men and by women. And also we divide those into 3 practices. One is risk mitigation, what they do before an event happens. What risk transfer is how, like insurance, and or how are the risk coping strategies. And this is divided by men and women. And also, in the end, we will have a very good idea on what is the capacity to manage risk, and if they don't have the capacity, why they don't have it, which will all inform the prioritization exercise that is part of all these guidelines. So in this one, we can see the document has this step-by-step approach, which actually it is aiming at unpacking the gender differences. We can see that the basic exercise of doing a risk assessment is to end up with a risk prioritization matrix. And this risk prioritization matrix, it involves 4 main steps. Step 1 is the data analysis, and then we are providing some guidelines there on how to, what are the types of data that is needed in order to do this risk assessment, where to find that information, and how to analyze that information. In step 2, there is information there on how to do the shareholders interviews and how to choose the group of different stakeholders, including men and women, for the interviews. And the interviews are basically to test the hypothesis we have, and also to see what the capacity to manage risk is for various stakeholders. And in one of the annexes of the document, you will see that there is a guidelines on how to conduct those interviews with those groups. And in the end, step 3, we have this prioritization matrix, which is the outcome of this process. And in that prioritization matrix, what's the way how to come to it, to those results, is by analyzing the intensity of risk events, the frequency of those events, and the capacity to manage events. And if we do it in a gender differentiated way, then we should come with 2 different types of risk matrix, prioritization matrix, one for men and one for women. And there are some examples of that in the document. So in the end, we think that by introducing this gender differentiated approach to agricultural risk management will provide us with all the inputs in order to start designing solutions to agricultural risk with a gender lens. We put in the document some lessons learned and some examples of how to design a gender smart solution to agricultural risk, but these are mainly illustrative because, as we said before, the risks are contextual, gender is contextual, and every solution has to be designed based on the information of the risk assessment that has been done. I would like to stop here, and we have seen the we have tried in this document to put the two sides of the same coin together. One is the gender issues, and the other part is the agricultural risk analysis. And it has not been easy, but at least we think, the team think that we are offering an approach on how to do it, and if it is applied, then we might end up with information that is going to help us in designing agricultural risk management strategies. Is this perfect? No, it's not perfect. But is it practical? Yes, it is practical. And we have been applying in various countries, but now the next steps, at least for the team that works here at the World Bank, will be to start introducing the gender lens using this approach that we have presented here. I would like just to end there and thanks everybody for their participation, and hope that you have a lot of questions, and we are looking forward to your participation. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Carlos, for that excellent presentation. Before we jump to the discussion, we're going to have a few comments from our two discussants. First, we're going to have some comments on the report from Sana Lisa. I'm going to pass the floor over to her now.
Okay, thank you, Carlos, for introducing the new report. I think this report brings the much needed gender perspective in the agricultural risk assessment and management. And I'm more than pleased to have a document with practical advice in integrating gender in risk management. I have three main comments on it, which I want to share with you. First, the first part of the document focuses on women's exposure to risk and notes that women farmers are more vulnerable to agricultural risk, mainly for the same reasons why the agricultural productivity is lower, as Carlos already explained. This part of the report might sound very familiar for those who have previously worked on gender issues, but I think it's very useful for those who have been more focused on agricultural risk management. Second, the operational approach. The second part of the report offers practical guidance how gender can be integrated in different steps of the risk management. In my opinion, this part of the book really adds value to the theme. The entire risk management cycle with entry points for integration of gender issues is covered. Carol's presentation did not go deep into the practical guidance, so I would like to show this slide that you see in front of you that describes sector-level prioritization differences for men and women. So the report includes several of these illustrative examples on gender differences related to risk. Third, the book concludes that gender-based approach to risk assessment is simply a systematic process to analyze, identify, and prioritize risk both from male and female perspective. However, conducting this in practice requires comprehensive knowledge on agricultural risk management as well as knowledge on gender issues. And I think it's essential to have a both expertise on teams that are doing agriculture risk assessment. I think this book or report offers a good guidance for everybody involved in the subject. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for your comments, Sanna-Liisa. We're going to pass the floor to Åsa now for her short comments, and she's going to take us to more of a field case study perspective. So the floor is now yours, Åsa.
Thank you very much. Yes, so I will give a few examples from risk-related work that we have done in Malawi, Montenegro, and in Rwanda. So I'll start with Malawi. And in Malawi, women have lower access to improved inputs. And this lower access to improved inputs explains about 80% of the gender gap in productivity. So when we were out doing our agriculture sector risk assessment, we talked to farmers in one village. This is kind of representative for across when we talk to farmers, but I just wanted to give one specific example. We talked to farmers in one village about agricultural risk management practices and about the uptake of this. And the village had received quite a lot of support on the different projects, including technical assistance and training. So we asked about the attendance of women versus men in these trainings, and it seemed to be that mainly women would attend these training sessions for various reasons. There normally wouldn't be more than about 1 or 2 men. So then when we talked about the uptake of these techniques and technologies that they had learned about in the training, they told us that normally the men that attended the training would implement the practices. Possibly also a woman with a lot of decision-making power in her household would implement. But for the rest of the attendees, they would not be able to implement this new practices that they had learned about until in a few years after, where their husbands actually saw the benefits of those few attendants that were able to implement the techniques in their fields. So normally these practices that they learned about, the risk management practices, it would take a few seasons for them to be implemented across the village for this reason. So in this case, of course, risk management would really benefit from more equitable access to both training for men, or that there were higher attendance from men, and also more access then to resources and decision-making power among women. However, we did some work in Montenegro. There, actually, the reverse was true. We were talking to communities that were involved in the dairy supply chain, and both just dairy production, but also in these communities, normally you process the milk into cheese, specific type of cheese, and this is an occupation that is really dominated by women. It's very specific. Men don't really get involved in the actual cheese making process. So when food safety trainings and good hygiene practices, which is of course also part of risk management for the supply chain, when these trainings were organized, they're normally organized in a more like a location that is kind of a city or a town somewhere. And it makes it very difficult for the women to attend because they're very tied to that house when they're doing the cheese. They need to be attending kind of the cheese making on a daily basis. So they can't really leave the household for a few days. And so the men would go to the training and try to learn these the food safety aspects of the process without really having very much knowledge of how cheese making is actually done, and then come back to the household and try to explain this to the women who are actually doing the cheese. And of course, a lot of knowledge was lost in this. So let me see. I want to move the slide for me. Sorry, apologies for this. There. Okay, so the next slide is Rwanda. So my point of these examples is that it's really important to know, of course, who is involved in the different parts of the production and processing. But I also want to emphasize, just like Carlos did in his presentation, that this can be extremely context specific. This is not something that we can just apply across countries, but even within countries. So this is an example from Rwanda, where we saw that, in fact, the production of different crops is quite gender specific, but that this really varies even between regions within the country. And Rwanda is not a very big country, but so when targeting, been trying to inform communities about better risk management practices, it's important to know really who in this specific region is involved in what type of production. So thank you very much for this.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Åsa, and thank you, Sanalisa, and also thank you, Carlos, for the excellent presentation. So we're now going to move into the Q&A portion of the discussion. And again, I encourage you to send in your questions using the Q&A or the chat box function. It doesn't really matter which one. We've already gotten a couple really good questions in. So I'm going to start with a question from Himanshu. And I'm going to pose this question to Sanalisa. I think it's probably a good idea. Let me just pull up the question here. So one second, I appear to be having.
Okay, so I think the question.
Okay, sorry about that. I have the question here. So the question from Himanshu is about whether or not there would be any difference between interventions targeted at households versus those targeted only at women, and I think you can probably address that.
Yes, actually, thank you. I think this is a good question. There is always some differences if you want to target only women or you target households. However, I think the main point is to include both the men and women and all the other members of the household on the interventions, and then see if there are obstacles for women's participation, and if there should be specific targeted actions for them. I think the household methodologies like IFAD's household methodology is a good example, or good example how you can start even risk management from the household and see what are the household's relationship and assets and how they are managed.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sanalisa. And if there's any follow-up question to that, please feel free to ask that in the same box. We have a question from Ale, and I think this is probably a good question for Carlos. And so the question is about gender differential in access to membership to informal social networks. And the question is about whether or not it is, I'm going to ask the question straight out so I don't completely muddle it up for Alemayu. So the question is, gender differentials in access to and membership to formal and informal social networks is considered a determining factor, if not the most important factor, in how men and women farmers respond to and manage risk. So he's asking if this was considered in the work that you all did in this report.
Well, thank you for the question. First, I would like to agree with you. The literature review and the analysis we made of the information we had tends to agree with this comment that you are making. Formal and informal social networks are basics, are one of the key, let's say, pillars that actually help to start removing gender-based constraints to productivity, to growth, and also getting out of poverty. But exactly for just those same reasons, it is also a key basic element in agricultural risk management. And I think that it should be also considered as one of the potential solutions. And in the document, in the last chapter, when we are having illustrations and some lessons learned, we also mention how important different networks along the supply chains can play a very important role in agricultural risk management, in the same way as they play the role in productivity and in general economic development.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Carlos. And this is a question, maybe I'll just give it to any of you who want to answer, probably Sanalisa or Carlos, given your involvement with the report. And it's about whether you have differentiated women and men assets from the household assets. So just a more technical question.
This is a very important question, and this when we started doing our work, that was exactly one of the big puzzles that we were confronted with. In our guidelines, in an approach like the one we are offering today, which is a rapid assessment of agricultural risk, and now with the complexities of including gender, it is not possible to get into the complexities of a household differentiation of assets, what assets belong to men and what assets belong to women. And that's not the purpose of the how we do we are proposing to do the assessment. We mentioned that at the beginning on the first part in order to show to development practitioners that there is a differentiation there, and the impact and the responses can be gender differentiated. However, when you come to do the analysis, what we are proposing is a much more simple analysis, which is to take the analysis, the subject of analysis, to be men farmers and women farmers, and do the analysis from there. And we are not going, we are not proposing to get into the complexities of household, how they actually are managing their own and responsible, because that's a very complex and it goes beyond the scope of the work. So we divided the analysis of men farmers, women farmers. We do the risk prioritization step-by-step process, and in the end we come out with two matrix of risk prioritization, one for women and the other for men. I think that is a big step forward from how we used to do it previously. Thank you for the question. That's a great question, and that was one of the first ones that we were puzzled with.
Great, Carlos. I'm going to pose this question to probably to you, Carlos, as well. But please, Sanalisa and Osa, jump in if you have something. And this is a question from Lillian, and she asks if it's important to consider the different household typologies in conducting this type of assessment, or consider, for instance, that all women in the community are a homogeneous group. So I think, Sanalisa, you want to jump in there.
Yes, thank you. Yes, that's the very basic thing that we need to, or not, the women is not a one group. There are different kind of women, different women, and we cannot consider them to being like everybody similar and everybody being more vulnerable than men, because there are women that are less vulnerable than men and more resilient than men. So this is one of the basic issues that you need to consider making risk assessment. Of course, you are doing it at community level, so all the detailed typology is not always possible. But yes, this we try to take into account. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. So we have a lot of questions coming in, but please do keep them coming, because the more questions you have, the more exciting our discussion gets. So I have a question here from Johnson, and this is a question about the results and implications. And Johnson's wondering if the application of the results of this study depend on full knowledge of extension practices. And Carlos, maybe you can decipher what he means by this, because he's also asking about the risk assessment between men and women. Do you want to take a stab at what you think he's asking?
When we're doing these agricultural risk assessments, the solutions are practically divided into three main categories. One is risk mitigation. Is whatever the farmer can do before the event happens. And all this has to do a lot with good agricultural practices and has to do a lot with improving productivity, like irrigation, like mulching, and all what we already know as good agricultural practice. That is basically a lot to do with risk mitigation. The second one is whatever you cannot mitigate, then you have to see the possibility to transfer that risk. And transfer the risk through an insurance, but we all know that agricultural insurance has a lot of limitations in order to reach smallholders, and not to say in order to reach women, farmers in developing countries. So whatever can be retained, whatever can be transferred, could be transferred if it is possible, but the residual risk will have to be going to coping mechanism. And coping mechanism is ex post, that is the response to how to absorb the shock. So when you are mentioning about extension work, I think this, in our view, is a keystone. It's a fundamental proposition that comes out of much of the analytical work we have done, that in all of these three types of solution, risk mitigation, risk transfer, and risk coping, risk mitigation is probably the most likable, the possible that is going to have more potential results. Because the more a farmer retain the risk at farm level, the more resilient they will become. And then the advantage of having extension services, the information system gears to the work that men do, and also specialized extension services to women, then that is a cornerstone of any risk strategies, we think. And if implemented well, we're actually strengthening the resilience of agricultural system, which is a very basic objective for the World Bank.
Great. Thank you, Carlos. That's fantastic. We have a question about women-led households in situations where men have perhaps migrated, are no longer in the picture. And so one of our attendees, Johnson, again, this is Johnson, asking whether or not you considered households that have no men present.
Thank you. I think this is a very good question, because the male-out immigration that often leads to feminization of agriculture is a emerging problem or trend in many countries, especially in Central Asia and South Asia. We have not tackled the male-out immigration in the reports too much. I think it's mentioned there, but it's one of the risks that should come up when you are doing the risk analysis, and how you can and based on the analysis you could see that how this affects on the women and men's vulnerability and capacity to deal with the risks. Actually, I also would like to mention that the World Bank and FAO jointly made last year a report, literature study, feminization of agriculture, that you can actually find by Googling the World Bank documents and feminization, where you get more information on this trend or phenomenon also.
Okay, thank you so much, Sanolita. We have a question from Olivia, and I think this question is really related to how health organizations and agricultural organizations work together to understand how health impacts of different agricultural inputs, like chemicals that are used in agriculture, are affecting women, and whether or not there is some collaboration when doing these kinds of risk assessments, or whether that is a consideration at all. I guess the question really gets at like how interdisciplinary is this? How interdisciplinary does the risk assessment get, and what other sectors have you been working with, or can you work with? So I'm going to pose that question. I'm going to pose that question to Åsa.
Oh.
And so I'm going to pass it.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. This is a really good question. I think when we conduct our risk assessments, I mean, because we actually assess kind of the structural risks to the sector, the risks that really have an overall impact on the entire sector, we do take health issues into account when they emerge as the biggest risks to large proportions of the sector. But normally they don't end up being maybe the most prominent risks, even though they have, of course, crucial importance to the household. I think, however, when you develop the risk management tools, and what Carlos was also talking a lot about is the mitigation tools, to look at obviously what are the health implications, just like we look at what are the environmental impacts of using different tools. When it comes to a cross-sectoral looking at kind of across different sectors, we do this a lot in agriculture because of the fact that a lot of risk management also falls under, like when it comes to really big risks, falls often under social protection. It's also food security related and nutrition, and so therefore it does have a cross-sectoral nature of it. I hope this answers the question.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Åsa. We have time for a couple more questions, and we have a couple of good questions that we have received. So we'll keep answering questions until we run out of time. So please do keep them coming. So the next question that I'm going to ask, pose to our speakers, is about whether or not this gender dimension risk assessment tool has been piloted anywhere yet, or are there plans for piloting it?
Thank you, this is Carlos. Well, the truth of the matter is that risk assessment methodology for like 8 years now, and there are in more than 12 countries. But that application on those countries has not being integrated with the gender lens. So it has been done like farmers, as if farmers are all one single unit, homogeneous group, without referring to men and women. Potentially, and also the results of that experience has been that governments have identified the components for improving their current agricultural risk management strategies, and also they have requested World Bank operations in order to support the policies and the investment that are needed in order to implement those strategies over the medium and longer term. In the future, potentially what we're going to do is to not just to test, but try to apply it, because we already have the experience on how to do it at pharma as a whole, but in the future we're going to apply it to countries where the World Bank is providing technical assistance, and that will be something that we are looking forward in order to do it, and to see what the lessons learned are from the different application of this with a gender lens, and then to see how we can move forward in improving the way how we are theoretically today placing this approach in this document. But
yes, So this is Osa. I just wanted to add that we did a little bit touch upon it in a few countries. So I gave some examples from Malawi and Rwanda, for example, where we actually tried to disaggregate a little bit the production that men and women are involved in respectively, and then also draw from other literature trying to understand how women and men were exposed to different risks. But as Carlos said, in the end, when it came to the conclusions, I mean, we didn't really assess the overall impact as much as trying to use this as a tool for better targeting some of the risk management interventions.
Great. Thank you for those contributions. We have just a couple minutes left. I'm going to ask all of the speakers to give a final word in a second, but so they have time to think about what that's going to be, I'm going to ask Carlos one more question. This is from Himanshu. When considering gender differentials, was there any consideration of separating differentials which were purely statistical and those which are actual results of sociocultural norms and their results? I think you understand what he's getting at.
Exactly. Well, thank you for that question. Actually, the guidelines are suggesting that there are basically two types of methodologies that are involved in this analysis. One is quantitative, and the other is more qualitative. In the quantitative side, whenever we have the statistical information, we look at the different variables on production, yields, area for different crops or for the main crops of the agricultural sector, and we do the analysis, historical analysis, time series analysis, and with that we could actually come out with the information that we need to do the quantitative analysis, which is the intensity of those events through the years, the frequency with which they happen, and also and that provides us with the very basic statistical information. If we will find in the future that this can be divided by men and women per crop, that would be like ideal, because then we could actually start separating both. If not, we will have to rely more on the quantitative side. However, we always have the qualitative part, methodological part, which is interviews with different stakeholders along the supply chains, and basically what the aim to that qualitative side is to assess together with the stakeholders what is their capacity to manage, because we can then show the statistics and say, well, look, in 19-something, here yields dropped for how much, and what was it? Was it a drought? Was it that you didn't put the inputs? Was it pests and diseases? And then if they say, yes, that's what happened, but why didn't you manage? Why the yields drop so much? And then they say, well, I didn't have this, I didn't have that, and then we start getting to know what is the capacity to manage. And then we have not applied this gender lens yet, but for sure, when we do, they will become these socio-cultural differences that you are mentioning there, which you will say, well, they didn't have information, there was no extension, we'll say a woman probably, whereas men might have a different type of constraints, and that will be the job to do in the next round.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Carlos. Let's do, we're just on the hour here, so we should wrap up, but it would be great to do a lightning round of last thoughts from each of our three speakers. So let's do that very quickly.
Okay, good. Just very briefly, this is I hope that this tool, I mean, and approach and book is very useful for you. And I also hope when you use it, that you would write a blog or a case study on your experiences and lessons learned on using of this tool, and also inform us if it has been useful or and how it could be improved in the future. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So this is Osa. So as a risk management practitioner, I'm very, very happy about this tool. I think this will add a lot, especially for governments and other risk management practitioners out there. I do think that in the end, it will really help better targeting intervention towards those that have the biggest success for uptake, men or women. But I also think that as when working with all types of gender interventions, that it's very important that all information goes out to both men and women for optimal uptake, regardless of who is involved in the production or who is has the most decision-making power. It's important to have a full understanding for both men and women of the importance of this.
Thank you. This is Carlos. Well, I would like to thank you all for your participation and your interest in this launching today of this document. I would say that we should take this approach as a living approach, as a living document. We still have not applied it as such in any country, and then we will probably be learning through the next coming years, and we will be having updates on this. And it will be good if we all keep in touch and if you have much more comments, please send us your comments. Probably through PharmD, comments can be sent. I will be very happy to hear from you, and we will do our best to get in touch with you and try to discuss any details that are in the document. We know that this is a very complex document. It's not easy to get through at the beginning, but and probably that's our fault of undertaking this challenge. But I think in the end, we hope that by applying it, and remember, this is contextual. So it is an approach and it is contextual. So all the analysis and the solution have to be actually on the context where it is applied, and think that's something that we have always have to remember. And we are all learning from this, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Carlos, Sana, and Osa, for a fantastic discussion about this paper. I've shared the link in the chat box, but we will be doing a follow-up following this webinar. I will send out the PowerPoint, if it's okay with Carlos. I'll send out a recording of the whole session, and as well as a link to that discussion paper posted on the PharmD website, where you can begin the discussion that Carlos just mentioned. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you for those of you that stayed past the hour. We really appreciate your participation. And thank you especially to those of you that asked such excellent questions. We very much appreciate it and look forward to seeing you on the next webinar. Take care.